Margaret Reed spent 30 years mourning a child she believed had died at birth. But what she didn't know was that her greatest loss was never an accident. It was stolen from her. In a courthouse filled with accusations and broken hopes, Margaret fights not just for her innocence, but for the truth she was never allowed to know. Across the room stands Daniel Harper, a young lawyer fueled by rage and grief, unaware that the woman he seeks to destroy is the one he has been searching for his entire life. Stay until the end, because the moment the truth comes out, their world will never be the same again. And before we dive into this emotional journey, tell us, where are you watching from? Margaret Reed tightened her grip on the worn bouquet in her hand as she stood at the edge of the small cemetery. The headstone, weathered and leaning slightly, bore only the name Baby Reed and the date that had been carved in haste 3 decades ago. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I'm still here, my love." Her eyes scanned the modest plot, void of offerings from others, as if her child's existence had been erased from history itself. Around her, the cemetery remained indifferent, a collection of forgotten souls marked by crumbling stones. She knelt, placing the flowers gently at the base of the grave. Her fingers traced the letters carved into the cold stone, and for a moment she allowed the flood of memories to engulf her. The hospital's sterile scent, the sudden stillness in the delivery room, the nurse's hurried steps. The doctor's detached words still haunted her. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reed. There was nothing we could do." Yet not once had she seen her child's face. Not once had they let her hold him. 30 years had passed, and the wound remained raw, festering with every unanswered question she had buried deep within her chest. Meanwhile, in a crowded conference room on the 3rd floor of the municipal building, Daniel Harper stood firm behind the podium. His eyes, sharp with determination, scanned the assembled crowd of journalists, activists, and curious citizens. He cleared his throat and began, "For too long, the truth has been buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. Today, we shed light on the darkest corners of our medical institutions." Murmurs rippled through the audience as he continued. Daniel, though young, carried the heavy presence of a seasoned advocate. He unfolded a series of documents onto the table before him, each one bearing the names of mothers who had been deceived, tricked, or outright robbed of their newborns under the guise of tragedy. "This isn't just about illegal adoptions," Daniel pressed on, raising his voice. "This is about a generation stolen without a trace, about mothers like Margaret Reed, who were left with graves but no bodies, with death certificates but no goodbyes." The room fell into a tense silence as he displayed a faded hospital record, a single line circled in red ink. "Disposition, deceased, no remains provided." After the meeting adjourned, Daniel retreated to a smaller room where stacks of files and photos lay scattered across a battered oak table. His assistant, Maria, followed close behind, her arms loaded with more case files. "Daniel," she said, urgency in her voice, "you need to see this." She handed him a thin, yellowed file with "Reed Margaret" typed across the top. Daniel flipped it open and scanned the contents, his brow furrowing. The birth record was hastily filled out, with signatures missing and glaring inconsistencies in the timeline of events. "It's like they didn't even try to cover their tracks," Daniel muttered. Maria leaned over his shoulder, pointing to a small notation in the margins. "See that? Patient was moved floors minutes before delivery. No supervising physician signed off." Daniel's jaw clenched. He tapped the file sharply against the table. "Get me everything on Margaret Reed. Interviews, medical staff records, anything we can. Or dig up. This isn't a mistake, it's a system." Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table that night, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound. In front of her lay the same battered leather album she had opened countless times over the years. Inside were photos of her young self, beaming with hope, hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. The final pages were empty, a brutal visual metaphor for a life interrupted. She thumbed through the pictures absent-mindedly, her mind replaying the delivery day in agonizing detail. The sudden rush of nurses, the way they had urged her to sign forms without explanation, the strange coldness from the staff afterward. Margaret had always told herself it was just grief twisting her perception, but deep down, she had never truly believed her son had died. Tears welled in her eyes, and her hand hovered above the last page of the album, as if willing a photograph of her child to appear through sheer force of love and sorrow. In his apartment, Daniel spent hours cross-referencing files, piecing together threads like a weaver, constructing a tapestry of grief. A pattern was emerging. Mothers relocated before birth, no witnesses allowed in. Delivery rooms, hospital records altered or missing. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted but relentless. They didn't just steal babies, he whispered to himself. They erased lives. His laptop pinged with a new email from a retired nurse who had agreed to an anonymous interview. Clicking it. Open, he read. I was young. I didn't understand at first. They told us we were saving the children, that their mothers were unfit. But I saw what really happened. It was wrong. I have names. Daniel sat upright, heart pounding. He immediately drafted a reply, arranging a meeting in a neutral location. Margaret Reed's name was listed among the cases the nurse mentioned. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about institutional corruption. It was about a very real woman who might have been deceived for decades. The next morning, Margaret hesitated as she opened the mailbox, finding a letter. Unlike the usual stack of bills and junk, it was official-looking, stamped with the seal of a law firm she didn't recognize. Hands trembling slightly, she tore it open and read, Dear Mrs. Reed, we are currently investigating events related to your hospital stay in 1994. We believe there may be critical information regarding the circumstances of your child's death. Margaret dropped into the nearest chair, her mind reeling. The words blurred together, but one line seared into her mind. Your child's death may have been falsified. The letter invited her to contact Daniel Harper, a name she did not know, but who seemed to hold answers to questions she had dared not even voice for 30 years. Part of her wanted to tear the letter up, to protect herself from a hope that could destroy her. Another part of her, the part that had kept vigil at a grave without a body, knew she had to find out the truth. Daniel arrived early at the cafe where the retired nurse had agreed to meet him. The place was nearly empty, its booths cracked and worn. He chose a corner table, pulling out his notebook and a small recorder. Minutes later, a woman in her 60s, with tired eyes and a guarded imposture, entered and slid into the seat across from him. You're Daniel? She asked. He nodded. Name's Linda, she said quietly. She looked around nervously before leaning in. Back then, they told us it was adoption. We were helping, but it wasn't legal. They forged deaths to move babies out, faster. Margaret Reed's boy. He wasn't dead. Daniel's pulse quickened. Where did he go? He asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Linda shook her head. We were never told. They made it impossible to trace. But she hesitated, then pulled a slip of paper from her pocket. This name. He might know more. Daniel took the paper, feeling the weight of Margaret's 30-year nightmare growing heavier in his hands. Margaret sat in her living room, staring blankly at the letter again. Her daughter-in-law, Amanda, entered cautiously, sensing the tension. Mom, everything okay? Margaret blinked, pulling herself from her trance. I might need your help, she whispered. Amanda knelt beside her, taking her hand. Whatever it is, we'll do it together. Margaret squeezed her daughter-in-law's hand, a tear slipping down her cheek. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to hope. She would call Daniel Harper. She would find out what had happened to her baby, even if the truth was more unbearable than the pain she had carried for so long. Margaret Reed's hands shook as she fumbled with the thick envelope stamped with the court's insignia. She had seen plenty of official letters before, overdue bills, tax notices, but nothing like this. Sitting heavily on the small wooden chair in the back of her flower shop, she tore the envelope. Open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The words blurred at first, but as she read slowly, they etched themselves into her mind with brutal clarity. Margaret Reed is hereby summoned to appear in court on charges relating to the illegal trafficking of newborns during her employment at South Bay Hospital in 1994. Her mouth went dry. She had never trafficked anything in her life. She had barely survived giving birth there. Margaret dropped the papers onto the small counter littered with petals and stems. Her mind raced in 1,000 directions, each more nightmarish than the last. A customer entered the shop, the little bell over the door jingling, but Margaret barely registered it. She pressed her trembling hands against her face, the words of the letter burning through her thoughts. How could they accuse her of something so vile? How could her name be dragged through the mud when she had already lost everything once? In a cramped office downtown, Daniel Harper leaned over a cluttered desk, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Before him lay a meticulously organized array of evidence: photocopies of medical records, adoption papers, anonymous testimonies. At the center of it all was a hospital log sheet with Margaret Reed's name scrawled alongside a series of suspicious notations. He highlighted her name with a thick red marker, his movements deliberate. "She's not just another victim," he muttered to Maria, who was sorting through a pile of witness statements across the room. "She signed off on births that were never recorded. She moved patients without authorization. It's all here." Maria frowned but said nothing. Daniel tapped a forged birth certificate, pointing to Margaret's initials at the bottom. "She facilitated it, whether willingly or under pressure. She's complicit. We can't let that slide." Maria hesitated, studying Daniel's hardened expression. She knew how personal this was for him, the son of a woman who had supposedly died giving birth, only for him to discover years later that he had been adopted through a shady, private agency. Daniel saw Margaret not as a grieving mother, but as part of the machine that had stolen his life. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that evening. The official letter spread before her like a death sentence. She tried to reason through it, tried to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. She had been a patient, not a nurse or an administrator. She had never signed any papers beyond the ones they had thrust in front of her as she lay weak and confused after labor. Her memories were foggy, disjointed from the trauma and grief, but she was certain she had never participated in anything criminal. Margaret dug through an old shoebox filled with hospital bills, discharge papers, and a few photographs from that time, hoping to find proof of her innocence. As she sifted through the faded documents, she realized with horror that most of the paperwork from her hospital stay was missing. Only a few bills remained, none of them mentioning her child by name. A creeping sense of helplessness overtook her. It was as if her past had been deliberately erased, leaving only damning fragments behind. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, a silent prayer escaping her lips. "Please," she whispered, "someone has to believe me." At his apartment, Daniel compiled everything he needed to present the case to the district attorney's office. He paced the room, restless energy crackling through him. "We have a real shot here," he said aloud, almost to convince himself. "Finally, someone will answer for this." He paused by the window, staring out at the indifferent city lights, his mind not on the skyline but on the faces of the women whose stories he had read. Each case bled into the next. Babies declared dead, mothers sedated against their will, paperwork mysteriously lost. In his mind, Margaret Reed had become the embodiment of all those crimes. He imagined her in a sterile hospital corridor, signing away innocent lives for profit. The narrative fit too neatly, the evidence too compelling, yet a small, insistent voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts he refused to acknowledge. Pushing the thought away, he grabbed the files and stuffed them into a battered leather briefcase. Tomorrow, he would move to have Margaret Reed formally indicted. Tomorrow, he would take another step toward justice, or what he believed justice to be. Margaret closed the shop early the next morning, unable to focus on arrangements or deliveries. The sight of cheerful flowers felt mocking against the weight crushing her chest. She locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, ignoring the puzzled glances of passers-by. Inside, she sat, behind the counter, staring blankly at the summons. Her phone lay next to her, untouched. She knew she should call someone, a lawyer, her sister, anyone, but fear paralyzed her. What would she even say? "I'm being accused of selling babies." It sounded absurd, like something from a twisted television drama. Margaret pressed her forehead to the cool wood of the counter, breathing shallowly. Somewhere deep inside, a stubborn ember of resolve flickered to life. She had survived worse. She would face this too. But first, she needed to understand how her name had ended up tangled in this nightmare. Gritting her teeth, she picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on the letter. The office of Daniel Harper. Daniel was reviewing a deposition when his secretary buzzed him. "A Margaret Reed is on line 2, she said, sounding puzzled. Daniel stiffened, then forced his voice into neutrality. "Put her through." He picked up the receiver, masking the surge of adrenaline in his veins. "This is Daniel Harper," he said. There was a long pause on the other end before a frail, hesitant voice spoke. "Mr. Harper, I received a letter. I don't understand. Why am I being accused?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch for a moment longer than necessary. "Mrs. Reed, we have substantial evidence linking you to the illegal adoption practices at South Bay Hospital. You will have the opportunity to defend yourself in court." Margaret's breath hitched audibly. I was a patient. I lost my son." Her voice cracked, and Daniel felt an unexpected twinge of discomfort. He pushed it aside ruthlessly. "Then you'll have your chance to explain that before a judge," he said coldly. "Good day, Mrs. Reed." Without waiting for a reply, he hung up, jaw clenched. He told himself it was just another necessary cruelty on the path to justice. Margaret stared at the dead phone line in her hand, numbness spreading through her body. The sharp finality of Daniel's voice echoed in her ears, leaving her feeling smaller than she had in years. She laid the receiver down with mechanical slowness, her mind struggling to catch up with the horror unfolding around her. Her son had died, hadn't he? Hadn't she mourned him all these years? Now strangers were digging through her past, accusing her of atrocities she couldn't even comprehend. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest as if to steady the frantic beat of her heart. Somewhere within the confusion and fear, anger began to rise, not the explosive kind, but a simmering, righteous fury. They had taken her child once. She wouldn't let them steal her dignity too. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and picked up the court summons again. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. Daniel spent the evening refining his strategy, unaware of the tidal wave he had set into motion. Maria sat across from him, her face drawn with fatigue. "Are you sure about her?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't hesitate. "The evidence is overwhelming." But even as he spoke, flashes of Margaret's voice haunted him, the raw confusion, the grief barely concealed beneath her words. He shook his head violently, as if to dislodge the lingering doubts. "Victims can lie too," he reminded himself under his breath. He opened a fresh folder detailing the financial transactions linked to the hospital's administrators, searching for anything else that could strengthen the case. If Margaret Reed had been a pawn, he would find out later. For now, she was the face of the crime. And Daniel had made a vow. He would not stop until every name on his list answered for the stolen lives they had helped erase, no matter what it cost. Margaret Reed clutched the crumpled flyer in her hand as she sat in the back row of the courtroom, her presence almost unnoticed among the sea of angry faces. The flyer, hastily printed and distributed by Daniel Harper's team, bore a bold headline: "Demand justice for the stolen children. Expose the guilty." Below, her name was listed among others, each one framed by accusations, none by facts. Margaret's stomach churned as Daniel rose to address the room. "We cannot allow those who participated in these crimes to hide behind time or feigned ignorance," he said, his voice steady and commanding. The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding vigorously. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of hundreds of accusing eyes, even though no one looked directly at her. She had come hoping to understand, to find some mistake that would explain the madness surrounding her, but instead found herself painted as a monster. She gripped the edges of her seat as Daniel laid out falsified documents and testimonies, each one seeming to shout her guilt louder than the last. The walls of the courthouse seemed to close in as she realized she had entered a battle she never even knew had begun. At the end of the hearing, Margaret hurried out before anyone could recognize her, her head bowed low. Outside, the hum of a local news van setting up its cameras filled the air. She kept walking, ignoring the shouted questions from a reporter who thrust a microphone in her direction. At home, she turned on the radio out of habit, only to hear her own name in the middle of the noon news bulletin. Margaret Reed, a former hospital employee linked to illegal adoption rings, appeared today during the first public hearing. Protesters gathered, demanding accountability for decades of injustice. Margaret switched off the radio so violently the dial snapped. She stood frozen in her kitchen, the echo of the broadcaster's words reverberating inside her. She was being tried not just in court, but in the court of public opinion, and without even being given a chance to speak. Grabbing a worn photo album from a high shelf, she flipped to a page where a single sonogram image was tucked inside. It was the only tangible memory she had of her son, a grainy outline of life that had been snatched away before she could even name him. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed the image to her chest. The next morning, Margaret sat stiffly across from a weary-looking woman in a cluttered downtown office. "Public Defender Laura Mills," the woman introduced herself, extending a hand that Margaret took hesitantly. Laura scanned the file before her, her brow furrowing. "I'll be honest, Mrs. Reed. Public opinion is not on your side. We're going to have to fight hard, and we're severely limited in resources." Margaret nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Laura tapped the stack of papers meaningfully. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Spare no detail, no matter how small." Margaret launched into the story she had lived with silently for 3 decades. The rushed labor, the cold pronouncement of death, the missing body. As she spoke, Laura's expression shifted from skepticism to confusion. "You were a patient at South Bay," she asked, incredulous. "Yes," Margaret whispered. Laura leaned back in her chair, processing this information. "Then why the hell are they treating you like a conspirator?" Margaret could only shake her head, her heart aching. Laura sighed heavily, scribbling notes furiously. "All right, we need witnesses, people who worked there, patients who were there at the same time, anyone who can place you as a victim, not a perpetrator. Otherwise, they'll crucify you." Armed with a list of possible names, Margaret began the painful task of hunting down ghosts. South Bay Hospital had been shuttered years ago, its shell left to decay on the outskirts of town. Margaret first tried contacting the city's health department, only to be met with indifferent clerks and missing records. "Fire destroyed most of the archives," one woman told her with a shrug. Next, Margaret visited a local retirement home where a few former nurses had been rumored to reside. She wandered the halls, clutching her outdated list, feeling like an intruder in a world of fragile memories and fading lives. Most residents didn't remember South Bay at all, or confused it with other hospitals. Those who did grew silent. At the mention of illegal adoptions, their eyes darting nervously away, Margaret left each encounter more demoralized than the last. By evening, she found herself sitting alone on a bench near the river, watching the lights of the town blur against the water. She whispered to the night, "Help me. Find someone. Anyone." It was the first prayer she had said in years, and it felt hollow even to her own ears. Meanwhile, Daniel and his colleagues gathered in their office, energized by the day's public hearing. "We're gaining momentum," Maria said, laying out newspaper clippings showing Margaret's name splashed across headlines. "People are demanding action." Daniel nodded, though a deep unease gnawed at him. He pushed the feeling down, focusing instead on the upcoming depositions. "We'll press the DA for an expedited trial date," he said. "The longer she's in the public eye, the harder it will be for her defense to salvage anything." Maria hesitated. "Are we absolutely sure she's guilty?" she asked. Daniel stiffened. The system was rotten. She was part of it. Maybe she wasn't the worst, but she's not innocent. He gestured at the files stacked around them. "We owe it to the victims to see this through." Maria nodded reluctantly, and they turned their attention back to planning. None of them noticed the cracks beginning to form in the narrative they had so carefully constructed. Margaret returned home late that night, exhausted in body and spirit. She kicked off her shoes at the door and made her way to the living room, where the small photo of the sonogram still rested on the coffee table. She sank to her knees before it, the sheer weight of everything finally breaking through the last of her defenses. Pressing her forehead against the edge of the table, she wept, not just for her ruined name, but for the child she had never known, for the years stolen from both of them. After long minutes, she sat back, wiping her face with trembling hands. She stared at the blurry outline of her unborn son, a fierce determination hardening inside her chest. They could take everything else, her shop, her reputation, even her freedom, but they would not take the truth. She would find someone who remembered. She would uncover the lies buried under years of silence and fear. The next morning, Margaret met with Laura again, bringing what little she had managed to collect. A few names of patients who might still live in town, an old nurse's assistant who had moved to another state. Laura flipped through the notes, her face grim. "It's not much," she said, "but it's a start. We'll subpoena the hospital's insurance records. Maybe there's something there." Margaret nodded, feeling the fragile thread of hope stretch a little tighter. Laura hesitated before continuing. "There's something else. Daniel Harper. He's making this personal. He's not just looking for justice. He's looking for someone to blame." Margaret absorbed this quietly. She didn't know Daniel, but somehow the idea of a stranger hating her so completely, without ever hearing her side, cut deeper than any accusation. Clutching her handbag to her chest, she stood. "Then we make it personal too," she said quietly. "We fight for the truth, for my son." At the next hearing, Margaret sat straighter in her chair, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the crowded courtroom for the first time. He didn't recognize her beyond the name printed in bold letters on his file. To him, she was just another cog in a corrupt machine he had vowed to destroy. But Margaret saw him, the intensity in his gaze, the bitterness in his posture, and in some instinct deeper than logic, she felt an aching tug in her heart. She didn't understand it yet, didn't know that the very man trying to ruin her was the same child she had been mourning for 3 decades. But something inside her whispered that the truth was not done revealing itself, and that neither of them would leave this fight unchanged. Margaret Reed tapped the address into her old GPS for the 3rd time. Frustration mounting with each wrong turn she took through the winding streets. Finally finding the modest retirement home tucked between empty lots and closed-down diners, she parked and gathered her worn leather notebook, stuffed with scribbled names and leads. As she walked through the sliding doors, the receptionist barely looked up. "Visiting hours end in an hour," the young woman said flatly. Margaret gave a polite nod and hurried down the hallway to find room 214. She knocked timidly before stepping inside. A frail woman with silver hair and bright, suspicious eyes peered at her from the bed. "Mrs. Eileen Carter?" Margaret asked softly. The woman nodded slowly. Margaret sat down, clutching the notebook against her chest. "I need your help. You worked at South Bay Hospital, didn't you?" Eileen frowned, then motioned for her to speak quickly. Margaret explained her situation in rushed, uneven words. Eileen listened, her face unreadable until Margaret mentioned the year, 1994. Something flickered behind the old woman's eyes then. recognition, and fear. "You shouldn't be digging," Eileen muttered. "South Bay wasn't just corrupt, it was dangerous." Margaret leaned forward, desperate. "Please, I just want the truth about my son." In his cramped office, Daniel Harper sifted through another pile of documents, growing more irritated by the minute. His assistant, Maria, dropped a thick folder onto his desk. "Birth certificates from South Bay, cross-referenced with adoption records," she said. Daniel grunted a thanks and immediately began flipping through the copies. His finger paused over one document, a certificate belonging to a child supposedly born dead on the same day Margaret Reed delivered. His eyebrows knitted together as he noticed glaring discrepancies. The birth time was altered in shaky handwriting, 2 different physicians' signatures overlapped, and the hospital wing listed didn't even match maternity. He scribbled notes feverishly in the margins. "This is it," he said aloud. "Proof that they were fabricating records." Maria peered over his shoulder, her brow furrowed. But why would Margaret's name be attached if she was just a patient? Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because she wasn't just a patient," he insisted. "She was part of it. She had to be." He refused to let doubt seep into his mind. In Daniel's world, Margaret Reed was the villain, and any cracks in that image had to be patched over if he hoped to bring down the entire operation. Margaret scribbled furiously in her notebook as Eileen Carter's guarded words spilled out. "They used to move the young poor mothers to the back wings," Eileen said in a hushed tone, glancing nervously at the door. "Far from the main maternity ward. Easier to switch babies there, less staff around. You wouldn't even realize you'd been transferred. You'd wake up and they'd tell you your baby was dead. Nothing you could do." Margaret's heart pounded as she wrote, desperate to capture every detail. "Did you ever see it happen?" she pressed. Eileen hesitated, fingers plucking at her thin blanket. "I saw enough. Complaints buried. Nurses threatened to stay silent. We weren't saints, but some of us didn't have a choice." Margaret looked up, tears stinging her eyes. "Please, is there anyone else? Anyone who can prove this really happened?" Eileen looked away, her voice almost a whisper. "Try Bonnie Jacobs. She was braver than most. Last I heard, she moved up north." Margaret thanked her, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. As she left the retirement home, she didn't notice the receptionist on the phone behind the desk, murmuring to someone on the other end. Word traveled fast, and someone didn't want the past dragged into the light. Later that evening, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by scattered files, printed articles, and blurry photocopies. A half-empty cup of cold coffee sat forgotten beside her. She traced her finger along a yellowed newspaper clipping. "South Bay Hospital faces allegations of negligence, 1996. The article spoke vaguely of irregularities and poor record-keeping, but stopped short of accusing anyone outright. Names were redacted, and the hospital had closed shortly after, citing financial difficulties. Margaret leaned back, exhausted. So much smoke, and yet no fire she could prove. She rubbed her temples and flipped through old photos. She had managed to pull from public archives grainy group shots of hospital staff, smiling nurses and doctors. She studied each face, wondering which ones had lied to grieving mothers, wondering who had touched her baby without her consent. The more she uncovered, the deeper her sense of betrayal grew. She wasn't just fighting for her name anymore. She was fighting for the life that had been stolen before it even began. And she was starting to realize that the truth was buried beneath more than just negligence. It was buried under deliberate, systematic cruelty. Daniel reviewed the inconsistencies in the birth certificates again, lining them up chronologically. "Too many mistakes for it to be random," he muttered. Maria sat across from him, arms folded, silent but tense. "We need a witness," she finally said. "Paper trails can be dismissed. Testimonies stick." Daniel nodded. "We have depositions scheduled next week. Some former staffers agreed to talk under immunity deals." He didn't say it aloud, but part of him itched for Margaret Reed to break first, to admit her guilt, and end this grueling process. His mind circled back to the strange look in her eyes during the last hearing, that stubborn refusal to bow. He mistook it for arrogance, for the cold-hearted defiance of someone who thought she could outlast the law. Yet a part of him, buried so deep he refused to acknowledge it, recognized another possibility, the look of a mother who had lost something irreplaceable. Shaking off the thought, Daniel returned to the files. Margaret's role had to be exposed fully and publicly. Only by making an example of her could they ensure this kind of horror was never repeated. He refused to let himself see the cracks forming in the narrative he had built. Margaret woke the next morning with a mission burning in her chest. Bonnie Jacobs, the name echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. After several hours of dead-end calls and outdated directories, she finally tracked Bonnie to a small town 2 hours north. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed her purse and car keys and hit the road. The drive was long and unfamiliar, but determination propelled her forward. When she arrived at the address, a tired-looking woman answered the door, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. "Yes?" she asked warily. Margaret introduced herself, explaining her situation in brief, urgent words. At the mention of South Bay Hospital, Bonnie's face tightened. "I don't talk about that place," she said, beginning to close the door. Margaret caught it with her hand, desperation rising. "Please, they're accusing me of terrible things. I need to know what happened." For a long moment, Bonnie stared at her, as if weighing her soul. Finally, with a sigh, she opened the door wider. "Come in, but don't expect this to be easy." Margaret stepped inside, steeling herself for whatever truths lay ahead. Bonnie led Margaret to a cluttered living room and motioned for her to sit. She perched on the edge of a faded couch, notebook at the ready. Bonnie didn't sit. Instead, she paced the room, wringing her hands. "They started with the poor girls," she said bitterly. "Told them their babies died of complications. Sometimes they didn't even let them see the body. Just paperwork, rushed signatures. I was a nurse's aide. I saw them forge records, heard the whispers." Margaret listened, her heart pounding. "Did you ever hear my name?" she asked. Bonnie frowned, digging through hazy memories. Reed, maybe. I remember one case, a young woman screaming for her baby, sedated before she could make too much noise. Margaret's throat closed up. "That could have been me," she whispered. Bonnie finally sat across from her, voice low. "If they targeted you, they erased you from the system. You won't find neat answers, just wreckage." Margaret nodded, the weight of Bonnie's words pressing down on her. She wasn't fighting a mistake. She was fighting an empire of lies, and the battle had only just begun. Margaret Reed tightened the strap of her worn purse as she stepped carefully over the crumbling threshold of the abandoned South Bay Hospital. The city had long since given up trying to demolish it, leaving the carcass of the once bustling building to rot at the town's edge. Margaret's steps echoed faintly through the empty corridors as she made her way toward what had once been the maternity wing. The paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the smell of mildew was thick, but she pressed on, guided by memories she barely trusted. In her hand, she held a crumpled printout from the city's last public health inspection, listing patient transfer records. She found the old nurses' station, now nothing more than a skeleton of rusted metal and shattered glass. Rifling through the remnants of file drawers, she stumbled across a moldy binder labeled Maternity 1994. With shaking hands, she pried it open. Inside, she found a single stained page. Transfer authorization, patient Margaret Reed. Infant transferred to Ward C, signed consent attached. Margaret felt her knees give slightly. She had never signed anything. Not in those chaotic, grief-drenched hours. Her mind raced. Someone had used her name, stolen her authority, and with it, her son. Miles away, Daniel Harper sat at his desk, thumbing through deposition notes when a plain envelope slid under his office door. He looked up sharply, the hair on the back of his neck prickling with unease. Rising quickly, he flung open the door, but the hallway was empty. Frowning, he picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed in bold letters. "You don't know the full story. Look closer before you destroy an innocent woman and yourself." There was no signature, no return address. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read it again. Part of him wanted to crumple the note and dismiss it as an act of desperation from Margaret's defense. But another part, the part that had grown less certain with each new inconsistency, hesitated. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. If there was more to his past than he had been told, more than stolen babies and hospital conspiracies, he needed to know. But not yet. First, he would see Margaret Reed answer for her supposed crimes. Justice demanded it. Or at least, that's what he told himself as he forced the doubts deeper into the shadows of his mind. Sitting in her kitchen later that night, Margaret replayed everything Bonnie Jacobs had told her, every name she had scribbled down, every half-remembered detail clawed out of frightened minds. She knew she needed something stronger, something undeniable, to break through the mountain of accusations against her. With grim resolve, she contacted Laura Mills and arranged a meeting. When they sat together the next day, Margaret slid the fragile transfer document across the table. Laura studied it, her frown deepening. "No chain of custody," she muttered. "No proper witness signatures, it's junk." She flipped the page toward Margaret. "And yet, it was enough to bury you." Margaret's fingers curled into fists. "Someone did this to me," she whispered. "I didn't authorize anything, I was unconscious." Laura leaned back in her chair, considering. "Then we prove you were drugged. Medical records, anesthesia logs, nurse testimonies. If we can show you weren't capable of consenting, we crack their case wide open." Margaret nodded, hope flickering to life. She would find the proof. Somewhere in the wreckage of South Bay's sins, her salvation was waiting, buried but not erased. Margaret's first real lead came from a hospice on the outskirts of town, where a former South Bay nurse named Judith Howell lay dying. After some convincing and a promise not to involve the media, Laura and Margaret were allowed a brief, private conversation. Judith's skin was paper-thin, her breathing labored, but her eyes sharpened when Margaret introduced herself. "Reed," Judith rasped, recognition flickering. Laura gently placed a recorder on the bedside table. "Did you work in maternity?" Margaret asked. Judith nodded weakly. They moved you, gave you something, said it was for pain, too much. You were out cold before you even delivered." Margaret's throat closed. Judith struggled for breath, each word a battle. "The baby wasn't dead. Doctor took him. Someone else signed papers, not you." Tears streamed down Margaret. Her face, as Judith closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. Laura clicked off the recorder, her hand trembling slightly. "We have it," she whispered. "Testimony." Margaret leaned closer to Judith's frail form, touching her hand gently. "Thank you," she choked out. It wasn't just her fight anymore, right? Judith had carried this guilt for decades, and now, at the end of her life, she had given Margaret the weapon she needed. Back at her flower shop, Margaret sat at the counter, unable to focus on the arrangements she was supposed to prepare. Instead, she replayed flashes of a memory she hadn't known. She still possessed the delivery room, the coldness of the staff, the sharp pinch of an injection in her arm before everything blurred into blackness. She could almost hear her own voice, slurred and desperate, calling out, "Where's my baby?" She grabbed a pen and started writing furiously, trying to anchor the images before they slipped away again. Across town, Daniel stared at his computer screen, rereading the anonymous note over and over. Maria entered, dropping a thick folder on his desk. "Court date set," she said. Daniel nodded absently, still lost in thought. "You ever wonder?" He began slowly. "If maybe things aren't as simple as they look." Maria shrugged. "Truth's messy. Always has been." Daniel closed the note into a drawer and locked it. He couldn't afford hesitation. Not now, but a part of him, the part that had always sought the truth, was beginning to wonder whose justice he was really fighting for. Determined not to lose momentum, Margaret returned to South Bay's ruins 2 days later, this time with a flashlight and a stronger will. She sifted through broken filing cabinets, overturned desks, and piles of debris, looking for anything that could reinforce Judith's testimony. Near what had once been the administrative offices, she found a soggy file box, half buried under collapsed ceiling tiles. She pried it open and pulled out what little remained intact. Rosters of staff schedules, handwritten notes, patient room assignments. One page caught her eye. A list of medications administered during deliveries with batch numbers and staff initials. Her name appeared beside a drug known for heavy sedation, authorized before her supposed emergency delivery. Margaret's fingers tightened around the page. It was irrefutable proof that she had been drugged into submission. Laura would know how to weaponize this. Margaret shoved the evidence into her bag and hurried back toward the entrance, unaware that someone had been following her since she entered. Behind a crumbling pillar, a shadow moved silently, watching her every step. Daniel, meanwhile, attended another strategy meeting with the district attorney's team. As they discussed media leaks and trial witnesses, he found himself distracted, zoning out of the conversation. The anonymous letter gnawed at the back of his mind. When the meeting adjourned, he lingered behind, staring at the city skyline through a cracked window. He didn't want to believe that Margaret Reed could be innocent. It would mean the foundation of his entire case, and much of his life's purpose, was built on sand. It would mean the people he had trusted lied not just to victims like Margaret, but to him as well. His fists clenched at his sides. There was no turning back. Even if doubt whispered louder with each passing day, he was committed now. For the sake of every mother who had suffered, for every child stolen, he had to see this through to the bitter end, no matter where the truth eventually led him. Margaret adjusted the sleeves of the simple grey dress she had been mending all morning, carefully stitching up an old tear near the hem. It wasn't much, but it was clean, modest, and more importantly, hers. Not something handed to her out of pity or desperation. Sitting at the small kitchen table, she folded the dress neatly, smoothing it with trembling hands. Tomorrow was the hearing, and she knew the courthouse would be full of people who wanted to see her destroyed, full of reporters itching to plaster her face across newspapers and television screens. She inhaled sharply, pushing away the rising tide of fear. In front of her sat the evidence she had fought so hard to gather. A small, carefully organized stack of documents showing clear discrepancies between her known signatures and the ones on the hospital transfer forms. Laura had even secured the expert testimony of a forensic document examiner who would affirm the forgeries under oath. Margaret allowed herself a brief, fragile smile. It might not be enough to wipe away the stain already splattered across her name, but it was enough to crack the foundation of lies. She slipped the papers into a battered leather folder and clutched it to her chest like a shield. Across town, Daniel Harper slammed a thick file shut, his face tight with frustration. The mounting doubts gnawed at him, but he refused to let them take root. He had built this case on facts, on records, on testimonies. He would not afford hesitation now. Maria hovered in the doorway, holding another folder. "These are the final notes for tomorrow," she said, her voice subdued. Daniel grabbed them, flipping through the pages. His chest burned with a mixture of anger and something dangerously close to grief. He didn't understand why Margaret Reed's case had gotten under his skin in ways none of the others had. Maybe it was her eyes, the way they hadn't pleaded for mercy, hadn't begged for forgiveness. They had simply asked for understanding. He shoved the thought aside and barked out orders for tomorrow's strategy. "We go in hard, no soft questions, no room for theatrics." Maria nodded, but her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, full of unspoken concern. Daniel ignored her. He would bring Margaret Reed down if it was the last thing he did. Justice demanded it. He owed it to every stolen life. Margaret sat up late into the night, rehearsing the words she would say. Laura had prepared a careful statement for her, full of legal precision and controlled emotion. But Margaret knew herself. She would not be able to speak in cold, detached terms about the life ripped away from her. She wasn't just a name on a court docket. She was a mother who had grieved for a child she never got to hold. She would tell them that. She would tell them how the system had failed her, how it had branded her a criminal without ever hearing her voice. She practiced aloud, her voice shaking at first, then growing steadier with each repetition. "I was a patient," she whispered into the empty room, "not a conspirator. I lost more than you can imagine." The walls didn't answer, but the weight inside her chest grew lighter with each word spoken. By the time she crawled into bed, dress laid out neatly, beside her, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but a stubborn refusal to be erased. The courthouse buzzed the next morning, alive with an energy that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with spectacle. Reporters clustered near the steps, cameras poised, waiting to capture every moment. Inside, the gallery filled quickly, curious onlookers jostling for seats. Daniel stood by the prosecution table, papers spread neatly before him, every detail of the case sharpened to a fine point. He reviewed his opening arguments one last time, jaw tight. Across the aisle, Laura adjusted a microphone and laid out their slim pile of evidence. Margaret entered quietly, her hands steady despite the dozens of eyes that turned to follow her. She wore the grey dress she had repaired, and though it was simple, it gave her an air of quiet dignity. She met no one's gaze but kept her head high, each step measured. Daniel watched her from the corner of his eye, noting the stubborn set of her shoulders. He mistook it for arrogance. It never occurred to him that it was the only armor she had left. As proceedings began, the judge called for order, and Daniel rose to present the opening argument. His voice was steady, clear, but every word felt heavier than the last. He laid out the charges, the evidence, the damning documents that pointed to Margaret Reed's involvement in the hospital's illegal practices. Every so often he would glance at her, expecting her to wilt, to show cracks. But Margaret sat unmoving, eyes fixed straight ahead, a living contradiction to every villain he had imagined. When Laura stood to counter, she spoke with measured calm, outlining the inconsistencies, the forged signatures, the lack of credible witnesses, directly tying Margaret to any wrongdoing. Then came the crucial moment. The expert handwriting analyst testified, laying out in excruciating detail how the transfer documents attributed to Margaret were forgeries. Diagrams, overlays, analysis results, each piece chipped away at the image Daniel had built. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Whispers stirred in the gallery. Daniel sat frozen, a cold realization creeping into his bones. The case wasn't as airtight as he had believed. During a brief recess, Margaret retreated to a small waiting room, clutching the edge of a chair to stay upright. Laura sat beside her, whispering encouragement. "We're doing better than expected," she said. "Their narrative is breaking down. Keep steady." Margaret nodded mutely, her mouth too dry to form words. In her mind, she wasn't in the courthouse anymore. She was back in the delivery room, half-conscious, calling for a baby she would never see, fighting through the haze of drugs and despair. She squeezed her eyes shut against the flood of memories. She could not afford to fall apart now. Too many years of silence had led to this moment. When the court reconvened, Margaret would tell her story, in her words, not filtered through accusations or misunderstandings. For the first time in 30 years, she would be heard. Back inside the courtroom, Daniel sat rigid at his table, barely hearing Maria's whispered updates. He stared at the battered folder Margaret clutched like a lifeline, and felt something shift inside him, something dangerous. He thought again of the anonymous letter tucked away in his desk, the message he had chosen to ignore. "Look closer before you destroy an innocent woman." The words echoed in his mind as Margaret was called to the stand. She rose, slowly, walked with quiet resolve to the front, and took the oath with a clear voice. Daniel clenched his fists beneath the table. He told himself he was ready to hear her lies, ready to tear them apart. But as Margaret began to speak, something inside him broke wide open. Her voice was not that of a criminal. It was the voice of a mother who had lost everything, a voice that trembled with grief and a strength born of survival. And though he fought it with every fiber of his being, Daniel began to wonder for the first time if he had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. Margaret sat rigidly on the witness stand, gripping the armrests so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The courtroom around her seemed to pulse with restless energy as murmurs floated among the spectators. Laura stood beside her, calm and firm, ready to challenge every accusation hurled against them. Across the room, Daniel stared at Margaret with a mixture of frustration and something else he refused to name. As Laura finished questioning Margaret about the inconsistencies and forged signatures, the prosecutor rose with a new, sharper angle. Given the lack of direct documentation, Your Honor, we respectfully request a genetic test to verify the biological connections mentioned in this case, he said confidently. Margaret stiffened, confused. Laura whispered urgently into her ear, "It's a trap. They think if you refuse, you're hiding something." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. Her consent. She had nothing to hide. The judge banged his gavel once and ordered the test to proceed immediately. Margaret's blood was drawn right there in the courthouse infirmary, under tight supervision. As she sat, needle in her arm, she found herself praying not for victory, but simply for the truth to finally come to light, whatever it might cost. The results came faster than anyone anticipated. Within a day, the judge reconvened the court. Everyone filed back into their seats, tension thick enough to feel, though no one dared speak aloud. Margaret wore the same grey dress, her hair neatly pinned back, her eyes steady despite the storm brewing around her. Daniel fidgeted with his pen, tapping it against his folder without realizing it. Laura clutched a slim file containing the forensic handwriting analysis and whispered to Margaret, "Stay calm, whatever happens." The judge cleared his throat and opened the sealed envelope containing the DNA results. His eyes scanned the page, his expression faltering for the briefest of moments before he composed himself. The room held its collective breath. "The court has received conclusive genetic evidence," he announced, his voice flat and mechanical. "Margaret Reed is the biological mother of Daniel Harper." For a moment, nothing moved. No sound, no breath, no reaction. Margaret blinked once, unable to process the words. Daniel froze, his pen slipping from his hand and clattering loudly onto the polished floor. Daniel staggered back from the prosecution table, his face drained of color. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The walls seemed to close in, the floor tilting under his feet. He looked wildly from the judge to Margaret, confusion and horror warring across his features. "No," he rasped, barely audible. "No, that's not possible." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her heart twisted violently inside her chest. Tears blurred her vision as she saw her son, standing there looking like he had been struck by lightning. Daniel stumbled a few steps backward, then fell to his knees right there in the center aisle, head bowed, his entire body shaking. Gasps echoed around the courtroom, but Margaret barely heard them. Her hands reached out instinctively, hovering in the air as if trying to pull him to her across the chasm of 30 lost years. She had dreamed for decades of knowing her child's face. She had never imagined it would happen like this, with chains of guilt and accusations wrapped around both their hearts. The judge, recovering first, pounded his gavel again, calling for order. But no one listened. The room had dissolved into chaos. Journalists whispering frantically, spectators exchanging shocked glances. Laura grabbed Margaret's hand tightly under the table, grounding her. Daniel remained on his knees, frozen, staring at the ground as though, if he just stared hard enough, the world would rearrange itself back to something understandable, Margaret finally found her voice, though it trembled. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice cracking under the weight of everything unsaid. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes wet and filled with something deeper than sorrow, the raw anguish of a man whose entire reality had been torn apart in an instant. She recognized it because it was the same grief she had lived with for 30 years. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed a hand to her heart, wishing she could tear it open and show him the love she had carried for him, even in his absence. Daniel rose shakily to his feet, but his legs barely supported him. He staggered toward the stand, as if pulled by a force he couldn't fight. Margaret stood too, her movements slow, cautious, as if approaching a wounded animal. They stood facing each other, a lifetime of pain hanging between them like an invisible wall. "I didn't know," Daniel said hoarsely, his voice cracking. "I didn't know." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "Neither did I," she whispered. For a moment it seemed as if they might bridge the distance, as if forgiveness might bloom right there in the broken, hollow center of the courtroom. But decades of absence could not be erased with a single touch. Daniel turned away suddenly, covering his face with his hands, a raw, guttural sound escaping his throat. Margaret collapsed back into her seat, too weak to stand, clutching the edge of the table as sobs racked her body. Laura spoke quickly with the judge, requesting a recess to allow both parties time to process the revelation. The judge granted it without hesitation, slamming his gavel and adjourning the session. As the gallery erupted into noise again, Margaret sat slumped at the defense table, staring at the empty witness stand. She could still see Daniel's outline burned into her vision, the way he had fallen, the way he had looked at her like a lost child. Laura packed their things in silence, her face unusually gentle. "We need to leave," she said softly. Margaret nodded, moving mechanically. Each step out of the courtroom felt like wading through concrete. Reporters shouted questions, flashbulbs popped, but Margaret didn't hear them. Her entire world had narrowed to one simple, unbearable truth. She had found her son, only to realize that their reunion had come too late to spare either of. In them, the devastation of betrayal. Outside, Daniel sat alone on a bench, head buried in his hands. Maria hovered nearby, unsure if she should approach. She decided against it. This was not something that could be fixed with platitudes or legal maneuvers. This was a fracture that reached deeper than any lawsuit or verdict could touch. Margaret saw him as she exited the courthouse, but stayed where she was, frozen by uncertainty. Part of her wanted to run to him, to fall at his feet and beg for a second chance. Another part knew that nothing she could say would erase the years stolen from them. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand and stood silently, watching the boy she had loved without knowing, the man he had become despite it all. They were strangers tied together by blood, by loss, and now by unbearable truth. Margaret understood, finally and painfully, that love was not always enough to heal the wounds life inflicted. Sometimes the deepest scars were the ones no one could see, and no courtroom in the world could render a verdict on a broken heart. Daniel stood before the crowded courtroom, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the sides of the podium. The final hearing had shifted from accusations to redemption, yet the weight of what he had done made it almost impossible to speak. Margaret sat quietly at the defense table, her eyes never leaving him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Before any verdict is finalized, I must address the court, and more importantly, the woman I wronged." A murmur rippled through the spectators, but Daniel pressed on. "I accused Margaret Reed of crimes she did not commit. I led a campaign against her based on false assumptions and incomplete truths." He paused, the lump in his throat almost unbearable. Turning directly toward Margaret now, he continued, I was blinded by my own pain, by a need to find someone responsible for what had been done to me. But I was wrong. I was wrong about you, and I am so deeply, terribly sorry." Margaret's lips trembled, her heart breaking anew at the raw sincerity on his face. After court adjourned, Daniel approached Margaret slowly, unsure if he had any right to even stand before her. He carried a thin file in his hand, the contents of which had shattered the final illusions he had clung to. Inside were adoption papers, records of illegal payments, and a letter written by his supposed adoptive father. A confession made on his deathbed, unearthed only after persistent investigation. In it, Daniel read the chilling truth. He hadn't been rescued from a poor, dying mother. He had been bought, stolen from a drugged and helpless Margaret by men who had profited off others' despair. Daniel extended the file toward Margaret, his hand trembling. This proves everything," he said hoarsely. Margaret hesitated before reaching out, her fingers brushing his for the first time. She did not flinch away. She took the file and clutched it to her chest, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Daniel knelt in front of her, head bowed. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered, "but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the son you should have had." Margaret's hand, still shaking, rose and gently touched Daniel's cheek. The courtroom emptied around them, but neither noticed. Her palm cradled his face, as if committing every detail to memory, the line of his jaw, the curve of his cheekbone, the faint stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. Daniel closed his eyes, leaning into the touch with a desperate hunger he hadn't known he carried. "You, my son," Margaret said in a voice that cracked with emotion. "You were stolen from me, but you were always mine." She pulled him into a trembling embrace, and for a long, long moment, they simply held each other, 30 years of loss and longing pouring out between them. Margaret buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, memorizing the feel of his arms around her. Daniel clung to her like a drowning man finding solid ground, the tears he had fought so hard to suppress finally breaking free. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And after so many years of lies, real was enough. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's name was officially cleared. The judge ordered the charges dropped and issued a public statement exonerating her. Local news outlets that had once smeared her name now broadcast interviews highlighting the injustice she had suffered. Margaret gave only one public statement: "I lost 30 years, but I will not lose the future." Daniel stood beside her during the press conference, his hand steady at the small of her back, silently lending her strength. It was not about revenge or anger anymore. It was about reclaiming what had been stolen. Margaret used the small settlement awarded to her by the state to repair her crumbling flower shop, the place that had been her sanctuary during the years of grief. Daniel insisted on helping, rolling up his sleeves and working alongside her, repainting walls, fixing plumbing, rebuilding displays. They laughed awkwardly at first, fumbling through the delicate process of forging a relationship from broken pieces. There were hard days, filled with painful reminders and missed opportunities, but there were good days too, days when they simply worked side by side, speaking in the silent language only family could understand. One afternoon, as they stood outside surveying the newly repaired building, Margaret turned to Daniel with a small, hopeful smile. "It needs a new name," she said, her voice tentative. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "How about Reed and Son Flowers?" he suggested, half joking, half testing. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy. She reached for the nearest pot of daisies and handed it to him. "Then we better start planting." Together, they spent the afternoon arranging flowers, replanting beds, and reviving the little patch of land that had once seemed beyond saving. Daniel dug into the soil with determination, sweat beading on his forehead, while Margaret arranged vibrant bouquets that seemed almost to hum with life. Passers-by paused to watch, some recognizing them, others simply moved by the sight of A mother and son, rebuilding something sacred together. With each seed planted, with each flower bed restored, the wounds of the past were stitched a little tighter. Late one evening, after the last customer had left and the shop was locked up, Daniel sat with Margaret on the front steps, sharing a thermos of coffee. "I don't know what kind of man I'll become," Daniel said quietly, "but I know what kind of man I want to be, the kind who fights for the ones who have no voice." Margaret squeezed his hand, pride swelling in her chest. "You already are," she whispered. He smiled, a small, genuine smile she had never seen before, and she felt a warmth blossom inside her that she had thought long dead. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notepad, scribbling ideas furiously. "We can start a fund," he said. "Help mothers who went through what you did. Investigate old cases. Give them a chance to find their children." Margaret nodded, feeling hope take root in her heart, as surely as the flowers had taken root in the soil. It would not erase the past, but it would honor it, and perhaps heal a little more of the pain that had defined them both. In the final light of day, Margaret and Daniel planted the last flowers in the small garden in front of the shop. They knelt side by side, hands dirty, clothes dusty, but spirits lighter than they had been in decades. Margaret pressed a tiny seed into the earth, covering it gently, whispering a prayer she didn't even realize. She remembered. Daniel followed her lead, pressing his palm flat against the soil. They looked at each other and smiled, no words needed. Around them, the garden bloomed back to life, not just with flowers, but with forgiveness, resilience, and a love that had survived everything. They didn't speak. As they packed up the tools and turned off the lights inside the shop, they didn't need to. The simple act of planting, of rebuilding together, had said everything. Margaret Reed had lost her son once, but fate, however cruel, had given her the chance to love him again. And together, mother and son had found a way to make something beautiful grow from the ruins. We, the team behind this channel, put a lot of heart and dedication into every story we bring to you. Each script is carefully crafted to inspire, move, and honor the moments that truly touch the soul. If this story spoke to you in any way, we would love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you can, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing more special stories to life. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.